Soil is one of those things that actually makes this world habitable for plants and organisms like us. It is our most crucial, undervalued resource. But we've been abusing it for a very long time. The second book that I wrote, Dirt, is essentially a look at the history of farming and the role of land abuse in the course and fate of civilizations. What does it boil down to? Essentially, the invention of the plow fundamentally altered the balance between soil production and soil erosion on the surface of the earth. Any resource that you are using up faster than it's being replaced, you are de facto running out of. We have done this in regions around the world throughout history. That book makes the case and explains how it has worked. But the basic idea is that if you look back at archaeological studies around the world, you can make a very solid case that soil erosion played a role in the demise of societies literally around the world. Now, I'm not arguing that soil erosion triggered the collapse of civilizations. It made them vulnerable. It reduced the resilience. For details, you can check out the book. The case, I think, is very well made there, and I can't do it in 12 minutes. But the archaeologists have done it for us. You can connect the dots. If you look today, what essentially the state of soil erosion around the world is, David Pimentel et al. Back in 1995 made the case that soil degradation has reduced about 430 million hectares of arable land from agricultural production since the Second World War. That's an area equivalent to about one third of all present cropland. Any discussion of how we might feed the world of the future that doesn't reference the loss of agricultural land we've had so far is missing the big picture, in part because what if we might be able to restore it back to productivity? Secondarily, Ratan Lal has estimated that the world's agricultural soils have already lost 66 to 90 billion tons of carbon, mostly due to tillage. So we've lost soil itself in great parts of the world. Think Lebanon and Syria as good examples for the long-term consequences for human societies. But we've also degraded about half of the soil carbon in this country that we had originally when the country was first colonized by Europeans. Now, I was asked to talk about the cost of soil erosion. And if we look at the losses caused by soil erosion over there on the left-hand side of the screen, we can divide them into on-site losses, things like nutrient losses, loss of organic matter, lost fertility, and so forth. It's actually a fairly long list if we fully accounted for everything, and I'm not trying to do that today, not in 12 minutes. In terms of off-site impacts, there's also off-farm impacts of soil erosion in terms of where that soil ends up, what kinds of ecological and environmental impacts there are from the way we treat land that are off-site. So I just ask you to bear in your mind that when we talk about the costs of soil erosion, there's on-farm costs and there's societal costs that are spread off-farm as well. We can think of those two dimensions. But I really want you to think about that column over there on the right, not to get you to buy the book, but to think about the long-term consequences of soil degradation and erosion on civilizations. Because what is the cost of running out of soil on your upland environments where it's vulnerable over the long run? It's an infinite cost if we lose our ability to actually maintain agricultural production on the land if you integrate over the future, because the future is a very, very long time. One would hope. So with that as a caveat, I was asked to provide some information on the estimates of the cost of soil erosion in the United States. And it turns out that estimates vary by over 100-fold depending on which paper you go to and which expert you ask. In part because they make different assumptions about which on-site and off-site kinds of costs to include. So you can go from $1 billion a year up to $44 billion a year, picking the way you want to do the analysis. The pertinent thing that I want to get across today is that it's measured in billions, with a B, of dollars per year. These are not small numbers. Any way you cut it, they're not small numbers. If we look at the most recent estimate I can find of, with a casual survey of the annual global cost of soil erosion just by water, one dimension of the problem, the UN FAO back in 2014, put together a continent-by-continent estimate. You integrate that all up, and that estimate is about $33 billion per year on a global basis. Again, the point is that these are big numbers in terms of actual costs to society. But if we look at the per hectare cost of soil erosion on an individual farm basis, we get the same kind of an answer. It's all over the map, depending on how those particular farms actually farm. It ranges from $5 per hectare to $1,500 per hectare in terms of the on-site costs of soil erosion. What that tells me is that the most important dimension in terms of the societal cost of soil erosion is how we farm. And it turns out that there's actually places where we can build fertile soils as a consequence of farming as opposed to degrading them, and we can turn it into a net positive. So the question that I wanted to ask is, can we reverse the historical pattern of soil erosion? What I'm showing there in my hands are the soil from our garden. The one on the right is essentially what we've done over the course of about 10 to 15 years of trying to restore organic matter in our yard. The one on the left is about the kind of soil we had when we started. And if it was darker in here, you'd probably see one is a lot darker than the other, although you may be able to see that there. The deal is that I'm a geologist. My wife, Ann, is a biologist. We bought a house in North Seattle, and when we tried to start building a garden in the yard, we peeled the lawn back off, and we basically had completely dead dirt. We didn't really have soil. There wasn't much life in it. It was there wasn't a single worm in it. You can see the light color there. How are we going to actually try and rebuild fertility in our yard, and what lesson does that have for actually global agriculture? Well, that's what we talk about in the hidden half of nature, because that's the story that we lay out. Because what we did is started to add organic matter. Essentially, we had the geologic part of soil, and you can think of soil as the interface between geology and biology. We had plenty of the geology. We didn't have the biology. So we went on a crusade to add organic matter back to our soil and try and reintroduce life to it. What did that actually do? Well, over the course of about 8 years since we peeled the lawn off and showed, I took this photograph, which again, I can't see very well from up here given the light in here, but what it'll show you is Ann's pruning shears here. There's the wood chips and the leaves, the compost that we added to the top of the soil. Down at the bottom, you can see it's still the glacial till, very horrible soil. But right in between, there's a couple inches of relatively fertile soil. It's darker brown, and you'll notice the roots of the plants just go down to the base of that layer. As I was writing the dirt book that documented how societies destroyed their soil throughout history, Ann was restoring soil in our yard right under my nose. And she's built 2 inches of soil here in less than a decade. You look at the pace at which nature builds soils, you measure it in terms of tenths of a millimeter a year. Here we're building 4 inches a decade, completely beating nature at her own game. How? Through the application of intelligence, labor, and organic matter. Returning organic matter to the land, what Sir Albert Howard called the law of return. Basically returning those nutrients to the land that have been taken from it. How could we actually apply this to agriculture? This shows you a picture of me visiting with Rattan Lal, a soil scientist at Ohio State University, who's run a long-term experiment in soil building in terms of no-till practices in the university farm at Ohio State. On the right, what you see here are 2 soils. The one right here is one that's been conventionally farmed for 20 years. On the right, it's been a no-till farmed with cover crops and manure. He's reintroduced a lot of organic matter back to the soil. It's far more fertile. They're able to reduce their chemical inputs to the soil greatly. In other words, we can change soil, and we can actually build soil fertility back using different farming practices than what we now call conventional. I spent the last year from about April through September visiting farms around the world that are practicing regenerative agriculture for a new book that will be out next spring with the title to be determined. But essentially, the thing that I found in common to those farmers that were very impressively rebuilding the organic matter content and the fertility of their soils was that they practiced a set of principles that are loosely called conservation agriculture that involve minimal or no disturbance, things like no-till agriculture, in combination with maintaining a permanent ground cover or cover crops as opposed to herbicides, and using complex rotations that can help reduce pathogen carryover, not growing the same stuff on the same piece of land over and over, but actually mixing it up in time and space. And then others that are asterisked here because they're not included in the UN's principles of soil conservation, but that I actually think is an area that merits an awful lot of attention and promise in research, looking at livestock grazing through intensive rotational grazing, changing the way that we raise livestock and getting them back on the land, back onto farms, so that they can actually contribute to building soil health as well. There's methods to do that that are anecdotally worked really well at the farms that I visited. Finally, down here at the bottom is why I think that these kinds of ideas may have legs. The reduced input costs from reducing fertilizer and diesel and herbicide use by anywhere from 50% to 90% on the farms that I visited results in higher farm profits. It's actually more profitable in the short term for the individual farmers. And I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to basically burn through the last couple slides because I was asked to comment on the social value of carbon. and I know that Wendy's going to basically comment a little more on this, but Rattan Lal in a paper 2 years ago argued that the social value of soil organic carbon is about $120 per ton. That's off-site value that's provided to society by having soil or carbon in the soil. And basically, if you look at the potential for conservation agriculture globally from the estimate by Weston Post down below, that could come of what you could increase soil organic matter through adopting those practices, not talking about the livestock yet. That comes to about $40 an acre in terms of a net benefit to society that could be added. The flip side of that is, what's the cost to a farmer for losing 1% of your soil organic matter? Tisafuli et al. In Global Change Biology last year estimated that to penciling out at about $66 an acre. In other words, the farming practices that we could use that build soil organic matter provide significant benefits to society as a whole that farmers are not yet compensated for. And the practices that degrade soil organic matter over the long run involve hidden costs for farmers that are actually fairly significant on a per acre basis. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll hand it over.
Next up, we're going to hear from Wendy Silver, who is a phenomenal professor from UC Berkeley. And I first met Wendy when we started funding in this space about 5 years ago, in her work with the Marin Carbon Project. And it's been amazing to see the excitement in this area grow over the past 5 years. She was telling me years ago when we met that when people used to just think about climate change, all they wanted to think about was, atmospheric. And we're going to keep the conversation up here on the atmosphere. And the sea change that has happened since then, and people looking down and thinking about climate and looking at the soil and what is under us is phenomenal. So, Wendy, go and take it away.
Great. So, can you hear me? Okay, great. So, let's keep it closer to you. How's that?
Yeah, he'll turn it up too.
Okay, great. So I want to talk to you about climate change. And we all know... It's not working. How's that? That's better. Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. Now I can hear it. I want to talk to you about climate change. And and where does that fit in with all the things that we're talking about today with regard to true cost accounting? One of the things that we all know is that climate change is happening. At least I hope all of us here know that climate change is happening. We know that one of the ways that we're going to have to address climate change is reducing emissions, right? That's absolutely critical. And there's been a lot of focus on how agriculture can reduce emissions. Let me see if I can get this to go. Oh, dear. We got a problem. Nope. We got a problem here. That's not going away. Or maybe you hit... There we go. Okay. Let's see. There we go. But what a lot of people don't realize is that reducing emissions is no longer sufficient to slow climate change. This is a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent synthesis report that says a large fraction of anthropogenic climate change resulting from CO2 emissions is irreversible on a multi-century to millennial timescale. People don't realize that, but it's irreversible on a multi-century to millennial timescale, except in the case of a large net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Well, how the heck do we do that? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do, and our land base is an incredible resource to look at, to investigate, to try to approach this problem. There's a lot more carbon that's stored in soils than there is stored in the atmosphere. Plants are a conduit through photosynthesis to help draw down CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in soils. So there's a built-in high-tech system that's taken billions of years to evolve that works very, very well, that we can take advantage of, and we don't have to invent it and we don't have to pay for it. So the technology transfer is there for the taking. We thought, well, this is cool. I wonder if we can use this to try to actually increase the amount of carbon that's stored in soils and maybe have an impact on climate change. We thought, well, where would we do that? And we chose grasslands. We thought grasslands would be a great place to start. And there's several reasons why grasslands would be a great place to do this. One is that grasses are evolutionarily built to store a lot of their carbon that they pull out of the atmosphere below ground and roots. And that's because grasslands occur in places where there's a significant dry season. And anywhere where there's a significant dry season, plants have to put a lot of energy into roots to go look for water. Anytime carbon gets deposited in the soil in the form of roots, it has a higher probability of sticking around than if it gets dropped on the surface in the form of leaves or other tissues. So if you want to build carbon-rich soils, having plants that naturally inject their carbon into the soil is a great way to start. Healthy grasslands tend to be very carbon-rich grasslands. Grasslands are also one of the most important cover types globally, very geographically expansive. 30% of the global land surface, about 30% of the U.S. land area, and then here in California, about 40 to 50% of our land area, about 23 million hectares. The majority of grasslands in the world are degraded because of grazing practices, right? That we have grazed without consideration and managed without consideration for those carbon pools, and so they've lost a lot of their carbon. There is a thought amongst the scientific community that we can actually replace that carbon through management. We did a thought experiment to see if this was going to actually be big enough to make a significant difference in our CO2 inventories. So using California with 23 million hectares of grassland, we said, well, what happens if half of it is available for carbon sequestration projects? And let's assume, bracketing numbers that we see in the literature that people have actually produced from doing field studies, what rate of carbon sequestration we could get. So if we got a 0.5 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year, which is a low rate of carbon sequestration, we would be able, over half the rangeland area in California, to sequester 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And if we could up that to a rate that's also been reported in the literature, 1 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year, we would sequester 42 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. To put that in perspective, livestock in the state emit 12 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent through their enteric fermentation. So either way, we would offset all of the livestock emissions. Commercial and residential energy use emits about 43 million metric tons. So we could offset half to all of the commercial and residential energy use, and so on. So our conclusion from this back of the envelope estimate was that, wow, carbon sequestration, if we can do it, even at a low rate, could make a significant dent in our climate change mitigation goals. We then went out and measured a whole bunch of rangelands in California to see if we could even detect differences in carbon. We tried to control for slope and climate and soil type, and what we found was that we could divide our rangelands into two categories, those that had received amendments and those that had not. And the difference in soil carbon was huge, 50 metric tons of carbon difference in the top meter of soil. Really, really big. That shocked me, actually. We really didn't expect to see that kind of a result. So I went to the land managers and the landowners and I said, amendments, you're telling me there are amendments. What are the amendments? Well, the amendments are almost always cattle manure. And that's when I was less happy. And that's because there's lots of evidence now that livestock manure is a really large source of greenhouse gas emissions, higher than you may have known. For manure management in the U.S. is equivalent to the emissions of methane. The methane emissions from manure management is equivalent to coal mining. And the nitrous oxide emissions, both very potent greenhouse gases, right? The nitrous oxide emissions from manure management is equivalent to mobile sources, what's coming out of tailpipes. This is one of the fastest growing greenhouse gas emission sectors in our country, is manure management. So what do we do about that? Well, ranchers have been spreading some of that manure out onto their fields. We went and measured that, and then we used our computer models to try to simulate out into the future whether or not we were getting a net carbon sink benefit or a greenhouse gas emission source. And what happened, what we found was that we got a pretty big carbon sink, but the amount of emission to the atmosphere completely offset any carbon benefit. So the way to understand this graph is on the y-axis over there. It says climate impact. Anything above the line is emission to the atmosphere. Anything below the line is a sequestration or a benefit to the atmosphere. And what you can see, we compared just grazed grasslands. These are heavily grazed with a lot of manure input from the cows versus manure spreading. Lots of nitrous oxide emissions come out of these systems. The soil carbon sequestration over long time periods begins to stabilize from manure and is completely offset by these very large emissions. And so they end up being a net source to the atmosphere. So, okay, raw manure may not be the solution, but what happens if you compost that material? Composting from a science perspective is complexing that organic matter and slowing down the rate of decay, making it harder for microbes to break it down so quickly. So we took composted organic matter, we did an experiment over a range of sites in California now, spread a very, very thin layer, and then intensively measured all of the biogeochemical measurements that we could come up with that we thought might be indicative of carbon storage and greenhouse gas emissions. I'll tell you right now that we saw no significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions after spreading the compost. It created a slow-release fertilizer, which resulted in a really big increase in growth from a one-time application. So the graph on the far side there, the red bars are the sites that received compost. The blue bars are the ones that didn't receive anything. They're controls, and this is a multi-year study, and again, multiple sites. And what you can see is we added compost in 2008. Even by 2012, we were still seeing a significantly more growth, more forage production, in the sites that had received that one-time application. We also saw a significant increase in soil carbon storage. That was really striking to us because I had an army of undergraduates in the lab hand-picking every recognizable piece of compost and organic matter out of that soil so that we weren't just measuring what we added back. So this is the carbon that has now become part of the soil carbon pool and is no longer in that little particulate litter phase. Of course, when you add more organic matter to the soils, you increase the water holding capacity. And that's a really important thing here in California and in much of the West. This is a change in soil moisture. So anything above the line means wetter soils. Anything below the line was drier soils. And during the growing season, we see an increase in soil water holding capacity and soil moisture in the sites that received compost. Again, we used our computer simulation models to try to figure out how long this effect is going to last. And what our model suggested is the compost breaks down very slowly, but what ends up happening is we've raised the ecosystem now to a new level, probably because of the water and nitrogen cycling, so that it's maintaining that higher level of productivity, meaning it's pulling more carbon out of the ground, out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground, but it's also maintaining a higher level of forage production, which makes it an economically viable approach for ranchers. From a climate change perspective, we use life cycle assessment to really compare and contrast this practice with other common practices, particularly manure management or just fertilizer application. And of course, we get a really big sink with compost, and part of that is from removing high-emitting sources out of the waste stream and putting them to a use where they're not emitting greenhouse gas. So that's one of the reasons that we're so far below the line, in addition to the fact that we're adding new carbon to the soil that wasn't there to begin with. Just a couple more slides. Oh, I guess what I'm supposed to say here, so we were asked to monetize, but I didn't want to put it on a slide because there's a lot of problems with these numbers, and so I want you to take that into consideration. I took two estimates, a low estimate from the EPA and a high estimate that was published in a paper that came out of Stanford last year. And when I used these two estimates, the social cost of carbon emissions from livestock manure in the state of California ranged between $450 million a year to $2.7 billion a year. Very high emitting, very high cost, especially from operations that congregate that manure, CAFO-type systems. The social savings that you get from doing something like composting that material and applying it onto the land just on 25% of California's rangelands is $780 million to $4.6 billion a year. Take that for what it is, but somewhere probably the numbers in there are in the middle there is what we would expect to see. It's a lot of money is what it comes down to. I just want to say that this kind of project, this is just one example. There are many different ways in which you can approach trying to get carbon into soils. From a greenhouse gas perspective, it's a very good idea. From a farming perspective, it's a very good idea. This is stuff we should be doing anyway. One of the things that worked for us was working in a very integrated collaborative group called the Marin Carbon Project. There's a field trip going Sunday if you want to learn more about it. There's many of us wandering around with this on our name tags if you want to ask us about it, with a very diverse group and very dedicated group of funders that have helped us manage this project. So just to summarize, how do we get science into action? It's critical that carbon sequestration be included in climate action planning at all levels, from the We no longer need to just focus about being part of the problem. We need to really stress that we're part of the solution. Soil is a resource that can facilitate both mitigation and adaptation, but we need more research in this area. We literally are just scratching the surface, sorry about the pun. And creative solutions may cross sectors, posing new regulatory challenges, but they also pose new opportunities, and we need people who can work across sectors to help move this forward. So thank you.
We were going to. Is it a quick clarifying question?
How do you compost manure? Okay. So we're working with a group of people, including the West Marin Co-composting facility, and they mix in green waste, mostly agricultural waste, so you don't just compost straight manure. We haven't had a problem getting access to waste, and in fact, the cities of San Francisco and Berkeley, where I live, now have urban composting programs. Cal Recycle is all over this, and they've now put signs up in the BART stations and everywhere else, kind of trying to encourage people to get their organic waste out of the landfills and into places where they can do some good.
I would say that really represents a wonderful urban-rural solution as well, compost, so win-win there. Thank you very much, Wendy. Next up, we are going to hear from Laura Bryant from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and one thing that was talked a lot about on the main stage, so what are the mechanisms to actually, incentivize these practices? And so Laura is going to talk about that from a federal perspective.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up for the soil panel. I'm so glad so many people love soil. Really exciting to see you. And we'll just roll our shoulders a minute and dive into soil policy. So I work for Natural Resources Defense Council. If you're not familiar with us, we're a national environmental nonprofit, and we do exactly what our name implies that we do. We defend natural resources, and soil is a very important natural resource, as David and Wendy kind of clearly illustrated why. So I work on soil policy for NRDC as part of the water program, and I think Wendy summarized very well why it's important to have healthy soil in times of drought, more water holding capacity. That also goes for in times of flood. You need the soil to hold a little more water then. It's a great climate resilience strategy. And then also in terms of the major water pollution issues that we're seeing coming off of Midwestern farms, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. A few years ago, we had the problem with the water being shut down in the city of Toledo. People couldn't drink their water because there was too much phosphorus in the water. And that comes from runoff from agricultural areas that could do with less fertilizer if there was healthier soil, and also would be holding the nutrients on the land if they had healthier soil. And I think we've seen this somewhere else today, so I'm not going to go into it in depth. Oh, no. Okay. But there are kind of general agreed on principles for farmers that are working on their soil health, what they need to do to have healthy soil. But it should be pointed out that this regenerative model that we have up here is not the status quo. For example, cover crops are a pretty common practice. They're kind of the gateway drug for soil health. That's how a lot of farmers move into the regenerative practices. So a cover crop, just in case you don't know, say you plant corn and soy and then your land is bare for a portion of the year. Instead of having the land be bare, you would plant a cover crop during that time. So it's a non-cash crop that's restoring the health of the soil, keeping the soil on the land. And cover crops are a really important part of that. But they're only used on about 2% of cropland acres in the nation. So we have a lot of ways to go, a lot of things that we can do to improve our soil. This picture is from Jonathan and Kaylin Cobb's farm. They're farmers in Texas, a lovely young couple that took the farm over from their family, and the farm was going under, and they had to find a new model, and they found this regenerative model to soil health. You can see they've got some livestock in with their diverse crops. And they had their personal reasons for why they changed to that regenerative model. But when you're talking about large landscape scale change, you've got to look at the policies that are affecting the landscape. And our soil policy in the U.S. has its history in the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl was a time when, in the years leading up to it, millions and millions of acres of grassland ecosystems with very strong root systems were converted into row crops with very little conservation measures because people didn't realize at the time the damage they could do. And that resulted in environmental degradation, health problems, death of some people, and an economic crisis that was felt for a long time. And so the birth of soil policy happened after the Dust Bowl. The Soil Conservation Service was created. That's the modern-day Natural Resource Conservation Service. So that's the branch of the government that's dedicated to protecting the soil on farmland and making sure we don't have a second Dust Bowl. But there were also a series of policies that were created over the years that we kind of refer to as subsidies. And these subsidies were intended to protect the farm economy and rural economies so we don't see similar devastation on farms. And unfortunately, some of these policies, while well-meaning, have been at odds with actually protecting the soil over the years and driving the kind of healthy ecosystems we want to see. And I'm only going to do a deep dive into one of these policies, which is crop insurance. So when people are talking about subsidies right now, crop insurance is the largest subsidy as part of the Farm Bill. That is where the majority of payments are going out. And I'm going to explain to you how crop insurance works in a minute, but crop insurance does go all the way back to the Farm Bill, or does go all the way back to the Dust Bowl. But it wasn't really used widespread until more recent years. So from 2000 to 2010, the average payouts for the crop insurance program, this is total payouts nationwide, was averaged around $4 billion. As you can see, that really increased in later years. In 2012, when we had the big drought, crop insurance cost was $17 billion. So there's a very large taxpayer cost associated with the crop insurance program. And there are a number of other costs as well that I'm going to try to explain to you how crop insurance works. So you'll have that takeaway and you'll be able to explain to other people. So in part number 1, a farmer wants to insure his crop. So you're a farmer and you want to insure your corn crop, and you'll go to a crop insurance company and you will purchase a policy that insures your crop. So very similar to if you have a car and you go and get an auto insurance policy. But here is where things are different, because the price that you're paying for that policy is not the full cost of what it would cost in a free market system, because the government pays up to 62% of that premium. So up there in number 2, you have the government paying 62% of your cost. So say your policy is $100 an acre, you only pay $40 an acre. So the actual cost is really distorted. And then in the next step 4, that private insurance company that's issuing that policy, even though the program is completely regulated by the government, it is private insurance companies that deal and broker the crop insurance agreements. That company's operating cost and their cost of administrating the program is completely paid for by federal subsidies. So their real cost for running the program, again, is subsidized. So again, you have a further distortion of what this program actually costs. All right, so time for claims. All right. So you normally get 200 bushels an acre on your corn for a year. You're a very good farmer. You farm in Iowa. That's your average. But one year you have a little bit of a drought and you get 150 bushels per acre. So the crop insurance is claim. What you'll get is you will get a difference on that extra 50 bushels that you would have gotten in a good year. So you go and you submit a claim for that 50 bushel difference. And what you get is the price that you would have gotten for, say, if the coverage level varies, but say 75% of what you would have gotten for that extra bushel. So you go and you submit your claim for that and you get your payout. But again, here you have another difference, because say if you're a driver and you have a car, and every year you get in some kind of a wreck. Maybe it's a small wreck, but every year you submit some kind of a claim on your car. Eventually your crop insurance premium cost is going to go up, and your auto insurer might not want to continue insuring you. But with the crop insurance program, again, the underwriting risk is subsidized and covered by the federal government, and there are rules regulating to make sure that even high risk policies are insured every year. So in many ways, the risk is distorted. It's separated from the land, and it's separated from where things begin. And what you have is a broader, increasing pool of risk, increasing costs, leading to a feedback of increased risk. There are many things that probably need to be done to improve the crop insurance program. We talked about the power of the agricultural lobby. I think, everybody has a lot of power. The environmental lobby has power. The food movement has power. But the crop insurance program is highly beloved. I know a lot of farmers that use it and depend on it, and it's an important part of their peace of mind and their livelihood. So just getting rid of crop insurance is maybe not the most realistic legislative solution. So the solutions are going to be working within the crop insurance program, creating reforms to make sure that it's not driving the kind of risk that we don't want to see. A solution that we're proposing at Natural Resources Defense Council is that farmers who plant cover crops get a discount on their premiums. Just kind of like a good driver discount, you would get a good soil stewardship discount. And we think that this will drive more cover crops. And there's kind of a case for that. So in 2012, in that year when we had the really bad yields, the cover crop farmers on the right had much higher yields than the farmers who didn't have cover crops. So we're trying to make the case that if you plant cover crops, you're lower risk. And we're hoping that we can, create some more positive incentives like that within the crop insurance program. So just circling around what we hope to get back out of that by driving this, say we increase in the top 10 agricultural states the number of cover crops that were used, and we had 50% of the corn and soybean acres planted to cover crops. We calculated that that would be an additional 19 million metric tons of greenhouse gases captured and 1 trillion gallons of water stored. And it's a little more tricky to calculate the nutrient reduction costs, the less water quality the improved water quality, but a lot of benefits. And I think there's, a viable solution here and things we can do. I will say the crop insurance program, it looks like I have some more time, so I can have 1 minute, just enough time. To say that right now the crop insurance program is under the microscope, and within the next farm bill, I think there is a really good opportunity to change and make some positive reforms. And I think a lot of people in this room have the power to be informed about that and to weigh in and to be part of that discussion. So,
for our final speaker, we have Richard King, who is both a farmer and an educator and really inspiring speaker as well. And I've seen you in the videos that have been produced about your work. So really excited to have you here in person. And go ahead and lay it out for us.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you who are here today. Hello, hello. Are you still here? All right. Well, I've enjoyed these presentations so far.
a little bit louder.
Thank you. Am I doing better? Shall I speak up louder? Is this better? We are communicating. All right. So, growing soil, growing policies, that's what we're talking about today. And I get excited about both because both are full of opportunity. So what do I think about agriculture? Somebody who raises some grass-finished beef for your freezer. It's some of the finest you'll ever put your lips around. Agriculture has had a greater impact on our life support system on this planet than anything else humans have ever done. And I'm excited that we can do better. I've seen people doing better, seen the results, and I get excited about converting our current agriculture into a regenerative, sustainable agriculture. So the time is upon us. It's time to get with the program. What else? We have to start with our life support system, and if we don't, we're just kidding ourselves. We heard a lot about soil. It all makes perfect sense to you, but I try to keep things simple. Life creates soil, and soil creates life, and they feed on each other. Soil builds life, and life builds soil. So that's a simple idea. Simple idea. Without photosynthesis happening, there is no way to grow soil. And if you go across the current agricultural landscape anywhere in California or the country, it ought to scare the pants off you about our inability to grow soil and how we are doing an effective job at killing soil. So here's the bottom line. We know that we've lost 50 to 80% of the soil organic carbon in the world's agricultural lands, whether we're talking grazing lands or agricultural croplands. And that's not a good report card. So how are we going to grow more soil instead of letting it erode, become less fertile? Well, right now we mask what we do to our soils by relying on more and more inputs, grow our food and fiber. And all those inputs seem to cost more and more money, and require running lots of big equipment around the hills and burning up a lot of fossil fuel. And not only that, some of these inputs that we do on the land seem to create all these unintended consequences. These side effects that we didn't realize were going to happen when we went to improve the soil. So, I get excited about soil because soil is probably the least explored part of the planet. And we step around on it every day, and we have no idea the complexity that's beneath our feet. We've got more species in a shovelful of garden soil than you'll find above ground in the entire Amazon forest. In that shovelful of soil. Think about that. Incredible biodiversity. And how does all that life, all the soil critters, how do they all get energy for growth, maintenance, reproduction? They get it through what? Photosynthesis. Life. So I love to show this slide because it compares the root mass of a perennial grass with wheat. And you can't see much, but let me just tell you that perennial grass roots go from here to the center of the earth. And annual grass roots barely get through the top 6 inches. And I might be over-exaggerating just a wee bit, but not a whole lot. So these perennial grass roots that might I've taken a backhoe and gone out into a perennial grassland, and I've dug a hole myself, and I've climbed to the bottom of the hole. And down 8 feet below the surface, I find an extremely well-developed cobweb of perennial grass roots as deep as I could dig. And why is that happening? Where does the plant get the energy to build roots that send them that deep into the soil and keep them alive from year to year? Where does that energy come from? Photosynthesis. So if we're going to grow soil, we've got to work with nature, understand how nature did it for free for millennia before we went to college. Right? It's not difficult. Because if we grow soil, we'll improve soil fertility and structure and porosity and aeration and the water holding capacity and reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers and chemical controls. And we'll reduce the amount of water we need to grow the dang crop or the amount of rainfall we'll need to grow the dang crop. And what does that mean? All we have to do is understand how simple these processes really are. We don't need to be experts. So what's happening on my place? So I raise some animals, and I have perennial grasses that are invading my annual grasslands. I've got soil organic matter that's increasing. My soil is growing, and the species and the functional diversity of the plants that are in there keep increasing. The land productivity as a whole is increasing, and the invasive plants and those pest species are in steep decline. What am I doing to get rid of them? I'm managing for their health and vigor and biodiversity and more sunlight, and that's why they're disappearing. All right. Customer satisfaction. It's just fun to be able to sell something to someone who really appreciates not only what they're eating, but how it was raised. It's a powerful, powerful tool. And I even make a little money doing that. There's a picture of my cattle. There's a picture of the perennials. They're invading my annual grassland. And life is good in Petaluma. So let's talk about another rancher, a very famous rancher up in North Dakota by the name of Gabe Brown. He's one of my great heroes because when you hear his stories, they're absolutely phenomenal. He's seen great improvements in his soil cover, his soil organic matter, infiltration rate from the storms, water holding capacity, tilth and wildlife and pollinators and everything you can think of. And he's having fun instead of being on the verge of having to sell the farm because he was a typical farmer going broke. He's got dramatic reductions in the use of synthetic fertilizers or herbicides or debt, equipment use, and fossil fuel, compaction, operating costs, and he's maintaining and improving productivity all the while. And he's virtually completely stopped even tilling the soil to grow his expansive acreage of corn, wheat, whatever else he grows back there. And he's combining all the animal and the crop production on his ranch and farm, and he's stopping the tillage, and you get synergy happening there when that happens. Synergy between all those principles that grow life. What else is happening? He's got some extremely diverse cover crop mixes. Cover crops aren't enough. The difference in what happens when the cover crop is half a dozen to 2 dozen species that are planted as a cover crop versus one species or 2 species as a cover crop is like night and day. It's about diversity. It's about feeding life. It's about exciting times ahead for agriculture. So that's one of the slides I just love seeing. He's got 13 inches of rain in a day, and look at his fields. And what do you think the bare croplands of his neighbors looked like after 13 inches of rain? What do you think the erosion was? What do you think the loss of soil organic carbon was? What do you think anything was? What a nightmare. But look at that. That's exciting. So what do people like Gabe and I manage for? When we're thinking about management, we manage for green growth as many days out of the year as we possibly can, and we want a great diversity of plants and their functions in the environment, and we want soil cover 365 days of the year, and we want to minimize our soil disturbance in any way possible, from compaction or tillage or some weird chemicals that are supposed to help us. What else do we have to do? We have to plan our grazing and make sure when we use grazing as a tool that we're honoring the need for a plant to remain its vigor, because without vigor, how will that plant grow soil? Effective biological decay. It turns out that livestock are a very powerful tool in our seasonal rainfall environments to make sure that all the old standing litter from the previous crop of cropland or grazing lands, we want that stuff to effectively recycle to build more life and not just stand there and turn black and gray and wither in the wind year after year. So if we do anything less than those things, what happens? Soil health declines. The soil is going to require more water and more energy and more chemical inputs and more money to prop up Mother Nature. But our current agriculture has sure done well at that. So when we manage complexity with a reductionist viewpoint, which is what we've been doing, unintended consequences often result. And that doesn't matter how good our intentions might have been. It's how we're approaching management that is part of the problem. So from my point of view, one of the most important things I've learned in my life is that we have to begin to manage complexity holistically. So what doesn't work? Reductionist thinking that we all learn and we all practice every day just doesn't work. It might work to achieve a particular objective or a couple of objectives. We might do quite well. And you're telling me I'm out of time. So what does work? A holistic approach. And we can use that to develop new policies too and revise old policies. that make much more sense and produce the outcomes that every human on the planet would love to have. Thank you.
One comment I was going to make that just came to mind, though, while you were talking. Peter Donovan is a well-known soil carbon person, and he says that bare land is a solar spill. So when we think about paradigm shift, I think that's something to really consider, that bare land equals a soil spill, or solar spill. Sorry, that's what I meant. But in thinking about those mechanisms and how we think about policy holistically, I would open it up to all of you, but also to the many folks in our audience. How do we think about these mechanisms in a holistic way? What is an example of a policy measure that would incentivize building soil in this manner? And could someone speak to that, either from the panel or also from our audience? Actually, I'm going to pass a microphone back to you, because otherwise no one will hear you, okay? And when you do speak up, go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
My name is Herb Ahrens. I'm from California FarmLink. We provide developmental services and loans to farmers beginning farmers, student farmers who want to get into farming. One of the big issues that I think is very negative for building fertility is the fact that when farmers are lessees of land, when they don't own their own land and they are paying rent from year to year, they have no real incentive to develop the soil and develop the land. I mean, they have to be able to make a cash income year after year to pay that rent. And unless we're able to transition beginning farmers into land ownership, we are going to see the continuing destruction of America's farmland and soils. So I think that would be, if I had to name one thing, one economic incentive I would see to promote land ownership among farmers.
Thank you. And I was just going to note that we're capturing notes from both the discussion and then our discussion here to really think about how can we, the charge this morning was identify some sort of shared principles, shared vision. So let's think holistically together in this conversation. And I will. Michael Dimmick?
I was just going to say that there is a policy developing here in the state, AB 1350. Governor Brown and Lois Walk, Senator from Davis, introduced a bill that would put $20 million into basically that they call a Healthy Soil Initiative, which is taking some of the science here and beginning to spread it, to scale it, I guess, really find the ways to scale it. Because in the end, as you pointed out, you've got the numbers now. Farmers need to be paid for those social contributions. And so I think we're beginning to see that those kinds of policies emerging. And obviously, if California can do it, the Midwest should do it, and then it'll become federal. So that's what I see emerging.
I just wanted to respond to the gentleman in the back that the problem of land tenure goes back thousands of years. It was a big problem in the Roman Empire. It was a problem in the southern United States. It's a long-standing problem that it's absolutely crucial that we figure out how to solve this time. I very much appreciate your comment. And the other comment I wanted to make is in terms of a simple policy change, the idea of changing the cover crop insurance. I mean, you cannot, if you practice cover cropping now, you are not eligible for crop insurance. That's insane.
Not exactly.
Not exactly?
Yeah, you are eligible for crop insurance if you practice cover cropping, but there have been cases of farmers who use cover crops getting kicked out of the program when insurance agents who weren't very informed about the practice considered the practice a risk and didn't really follow the rules of the program. And there are a lot of rules about when you can plant the cover crops, when you can seed them, when you can harvest them, when you can kill them that are very confusing. They change from year to year. USDA has tried to fix this with task force and creating new rules, but sometimes the education doesn't trickle down to the crop insurance agents, and you still have examples of farmers who are just kind of afraid to grow their cover crops because it might cost them their crop insurance. So I agree with the loaning and leasing as one of the top areas where we need to look at policy opportunities, and I've spent some time researching it. And it's a matter of how can we make that happen? How can we really change loaning and leasing? So first of all, we have more farm ownership. And second of all, how can we make banks and lenders aware of the need for good soil stewardship on the farm, so that's valued in the loaning policies, and educating more landowners about the need to have soil health on their farms. Maybe landowners would be more willing to give discounts to their renting farmers if they knew that their farmers were taking care of their land and the stewardship. So I think that's a good one. And I'm really excited about the Healthy Soils Initiative in California, and I would like to see other states adopt that model. I want to see how it develops.
Hello, my name is Peter. I'm from the UK. I'd like to address this question that everybody from the people at the Paris talks has been addressing to the discussions today, which is, how do you measure the improvement of good agricultural practice? For example, composting, rotations, cover crops, all these questions. Because either you have two questions. Either you penalize the sinner or you benefit the goodie. If you assume the latter, you have two ways of doing this. One is by measurement, the improvement of soil organic matter. The other is systems. If people follow a system, then they get rewarded. Now, both have got positives and negatives, but I would like to know what you think about this question of measurement, given that changes in soil organic matter or soil carbon happen very, very slowly and can be easily reversed. Yet we have to address the question.
Is this, you guys can hear me? Okay, I just want to address that really quickly. I think that when I started this work several years ago, I wasn't sure we would be able to easily detect changes in soil carbon, and we are able to easily detect changes in soil carbon. Woo. Of course, it's expensive to measure every single, to do what we did at a scientific scale is not within reach to do on everybody's farm. But all of our data and all of my colleagues' data are all going into these computer models that are becoming very, very good and a pretty good proxy. So that's going to help us understand when we get some basic environmental conditions, a lot of which now is available through satellites. And there's a group at NASA that we're working with to try to help improve our ability to detect soil carbon from space. And if we can do that, it gives us information. I just want to comment on the system. Rewarding people for having an increase in soil carbon or an end result relative to following a system. And I think one of the problems with following a prescribed system is that the most successful farmers and ranchers are the ones that are able to practice adaptive management, because the environment is changing around us very rapidly with climate change, with land use, with new pressures and new regulations and new markets. And I think that being able to alter your management to fit the need and to fit the climate and to adapt to the new conditions that you have, we need to be able to give people the room to do that and be successful, as opposed to making them follow a very prescribed path. We started in on the compost project because ranchers told us they thought it would work. This wasn't something that came from above, it came from below. And I think we need to listen more to what ranchers are telling us is successful, back that up with some scientific evidence. In some cases, some of the things they thought might work didn't work. So I think we need to follow that up with some science and have that iterative communication, and then use that to help stimulate policy that facilitates that kind of action. And I do agree it's reversible, but I think that also is common sense.
Okay, but can I just follow up by saying this question that the Australians have got very close to having a law which actually benefits people who improve the soil carbon. Even they, with all the best will in the world, are struggling a bit with the measurement of this question. And yet all the resources we have, if we want to have a policy for 5 years, where do we want to be? We should be in a position, surely, to say we have the technology to be able to measure soil carbon easily. At the moment, it's complicated.
Well, I mean, I think that it's technology that's just improving, and I think the reality is that we know we get an increase. It depends on how much you want to know, how many decimal places you want to know about the scale of that increase. And so if we want to know the scale of that increase to 2 or 3 decimal places, which is what I get, actually 4 decimal places on my instrument in my laboratory, great, then you're going to need a laboratory to do that. If you want to know that you're getting an increase in carbon and that you're not losing carbon, which is the background condition, by the way, for global grasslands right now, then we know that certain practices are likely to lead to an increase in carbon over time. So if we get away from we're paying you on a per ton basis to we're paying you because we know you're practicing good practices and we know there's going to be year-to-year variability, I think we'll be successful.
Carl, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hello? Yes. I'm Carl Anthony, and I'm with Breakthrough Communities, a nonprofit organization that is helping to mobilize communities of color and resident populations in our metropolitan regions. And my comment and also question is, how can we find new ways to move the farming processes or to capture the food markets that exist in our cities and our metropolitan regions? We know from experience that the farm to schools model is a very important addition to the lexicon of practices in our metropolitan regions, because the students benefit from not only being able to get access to learning technology about the farms and what farming is. So my question is, with this comment, is how can we take advantage of the fact that our populations are growing in the cities and either alleviate that process by making farming more decentralized, or finding ways to capture good practices that are close to the cities and integrated with the urban development that we have.
Does someone want to take that? I mean, I do think that thinking about the role of composting and urban composting as, that urban-rural solution is one way of doing that, and seeing the growth of community composting across this country in urban areas, and then tying it to the work that is being described here is one way. But I certainly would open it up to the panelists or other folks in the room as well to address that. Well, was it directly related to this comment? Okay. Would anyone else like to address that? Carl's question here. I think that composting is one critical piece, and something that, when we look at the research that comes out of the Marin Carbon Project and the amazing success of compost, the question then becomes, where do we get all of that compost, and what does that infrastructure look like that needs to be set up? What are the policies that incentivize that infrastructure? And there's certainly urban implications there. I know Sam had a question.
Sam Dryden. Sam Dryden.
I'm going to speak for Sam. This is Sam Dryden. He just wanted to point out that he feels that this is important to talk about in a different framework. To put it in the framework of infrastructure and depleting resources. And you can look at things like investment tax credits. And to Wendy's point, it's important to just acknowledge that something's changing when you look at measurement and begin doing it. Whether it's a creating or diluting asset. Creative or diluting? No. Oh, creating or diluting. Sorry.
Do any of the panelists? I mean, I think that that's really important. If you think about what are the other ways to think about incentivizing these practices, and that the tax credits are certainly another type of subsidy that is currently distorted in many ways in our policy system, and that needs to be addressed as well.
That's something I've looked at too. Tax credits doesn't seem like this is working. But if anybody has any great ideas about tax credits or ownership, lending, leasing policies, please get in touch with me because I'm looking for new ideas of things we can do. So, yeah.
Certainly, yeah. Sure, and then I'm going to...
What are their successes and what we can learn from them, what we can share with them. And also, one thing that I would like to invite you is to know what kind of, how they are promoting their practices, because we are coming out with a lot of tax from the U.S., permaculture and regenerative agriculture, but they already have been working for 500 years in milpas, chinampas, that are very sustainable, are capturing carbon, and are, so we have to learn from them. And I invite you to come to the conference. I have some flyers if you want to get one. And thank you so much for the presentation. It's amazing.
Absolutely. And I just want to second your comment about CalCAN, the California Climate and Agriculture Network. Renata Brillinger and Jeannie Merrill are here today, and they're an amazing resource on California policy on this very topic. And let's see, Bridget, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's don't lose one of the really important parts of this discussion is the water retention that happens with these cover crops, because I think this is it's a big idea right now, very important. Could be some great resources, financial, also some big lobbying help as well, because the water lobby is huge. And I think for the farmers as well, there's just a really nice story there. Plant the cover crops. You don't need as much water. You're really performing during the drought. I loved your things. I just wanted to make sure just for the group that we really start to think it's not just about climate. It's also about water. And that's a really important part of this conversation.
Yeah, it's about climate, it's about water, it's about crop yield, it's about biodiversity. I mean, all four can benefit from restoration of soil health.
Other questions?
Sounds like a holistic approach is needed.
Hi, my name's Erin. We touched on maybe an answer to this earlier, thinking. Sure. Can you hear me now? Kind of. No, now.
Straight into the microphone.
Now.
Yeah, that's better.
Great. We touched on this a little bit earlier in thinking about some of the solutions to how to actually implement a lot of the changes that we're talking about right now. But something that has stuck with me from the conversation earlier this morning was how the unintended consequences that you mentioned and the additional inputs that we are putting into the land and the farms and soils right now are actually contributing to GDP in a positive way, and not using those additional inputs is not captured in our GDP system. So if you have healthy soil, you aren't buying those things, and that isn't captured in our system right now. I just wonder if you might be able to speak to how to restructure and flip that such that the regenerative practices are actually captured in our economic system in a positive way. Does that question make sense?
I'm not sure how to flip it and capture it, but one thing, and I think it would be a good thing for like a small economic study if somebody wanted to do that, like in their grad research or PhD research, just kind of look at that.
Just speak up a little.
Yeah. Sorry, we only have a certain number of working mics. But I will say that there are growing businesses around regenerative agriculture. So cover crop seed dealing is getting bigger. Right now, if we wanted to increase to 50% of corn and soy planted to cover crop acres, we would need a lot more seed. So a lot more businesses around that. I was just talking to a colleague, and we just had this harebrained idea at lunch that, if there were a way to get urban waste compost out to the rural economy, maybe seed dealers would be natural salesmen for composting, since they're already going out and working on soil health. So I think there are a number of ways that, small rural economies are benefiting from these practices. There's like a lot of business. So National Wildlife Federation did something called the Small Business Report on cover crops, so you might be interested, that looks in the different ways that just that specific practice contributes to rural economies.
Okay, so I have a gentleman there, then Tim, and Anne, and then we'll go to you. So we'll have 4 questions, and that might be as much time as we have before we wrap up.
I got a quick question for Wendy, which is, I may have missed it, in which case I apologize. Could you remind us of the application rates of your compost? And coming from that, there's an implication, is there enough? Can we make enough compost to have an impact? And then a slight rider question is, do you have the same results on a glaciated rich soil, or is it the results you have, is this based on a Californian sort of free draining sandy soil?
So application rates, we used a half inch. We have had the state of California got a bunch of scientists together to really discuss and debate this and think carefully, and we think we could go a lot smaller. We don't think that, we started out with applying a small amount, what we thought was a small amount, but also what that was similar to what the manure application rate was. So 1/4 inch would probably be fine. You could probably even go smaller than that if you can actually spread a smaller amount of that. I don't think it really matters. Our models suggest a smaller amount more frequently has the same effect over time as a larger amount less frequently. With regard to waste capture, we've done the analysis for California. And in California, we've estimated, working with numbers from CalRecycle, which is the waste management agency that we've been working with on this, that enough organic waste is going into landfills and manure slurry and capturing a little bit of the paper waste, we could apply every 17 to 40 years. And since you get the biggest bang for your buck every 30 years, reapplying to California every 17 to 40 years within that range seems to be fine. And what's going to happen is we're not going to cover all of California. We're going to cover some areas that will receive it a little bit more frequently and some areas that receive it less frequently. And I think people, if they used wise management and adaptive management, would do just fine. And then what was the third question? Oh, with regard to glaciated soils, we actually do have some glaciated soils in California. What we did right now, we've picked, our first study was on 2 end members. One is a place that's been grazed for 40 years and has had, but is still fairly productive. And another was on a site that was pretty darn degraded. And we got the same shape of results and similar magnitudes. In other words, the site that was a little higher still increased, and the site that was lower still increased. We're now moving down to, we just got a grant to go do some work in Southern California, which is a much drier climate. And so that'll be really interesting. And I have colleagues now that are doing the science, trying to get some plots out on the ground to do the science to follow that up. There's no ecological, biogeochemical, soils geo-reason why glaciated soils should react differently. I mean, you do need to have some soil air, but whatever you're doing, you're adding what he's calling soil as opposed to dirt. And so that should stimulate plant growth and stimulate the process.
Hi, this is a question for Richard, and by extension, your colleague, rancher friend in North Dakota. So what are your neighbors doing? Do they think you're nuts, or are they looking and adapting your ways?
The neighbors tend to shake their heads. Why are they doing that? They must be spending a lot of money to do all that. I can't afford it. when in fact the truth is the opposite. They're spending less money, they're making more money, and the productivity and improvement of biodiversity and wildlife and everything else is going off the charts. So I'm glad you asked the question, because one of the biggest things that we face is our own beliefs, our own paradigms, our own traditions that we tend to believe are, well, that's what everybody does, and we all do it because that's the right thing to do. So new ideas, new paradigms are not easy sells, and that's why you have to keep things simple. That's why you have to channel it towards discovery and helping people get excited about new ideas instead of having them feel like you're pointing a finger at them, because the results will be dramatically different, especially with farmers and ranchers. We don't like people telling us what the hell to do.
I'm Ann Threpp from the Berkeley Food Institute, and I just wanted to make a brief comment and then ask a question. One of the things that Laura alluded to and Kathleen Merrigan alluded to is the fact that there are some programs through the Farm Bill that do support this kind of soil health practice, mainly through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And one of the things I think we can all do is work with coalitions and groups that are helping to defend those types of programs that are providing support to growers to do things like grow more compost, use compost, grow cover crops, and a variety of incentive programs that are, I mean, there are these incentive programs available, but every time the Farm Bill comes around, they're under fire. So there are a number of organizations that are involved in that sort of political and policy action to really try to support those types of efforts. And I mean, interestingly enough, some of those programs have been quite successful in certain areas of the country to get more growers engaged, at least to provide, some support to these. But in other areas, they're really underutilized. And actually, we've been doing some work with NRCS on this very issue of soil health. And I think one of the clear messages that's coming out of this is that, frankly, a lot of farmers are not particularly interested in the climate benefits per se, but the co-benefits that you've all described are so important. The productivity gains. And having worked in farming for many years myself, I know that the majority of the farmers were adopting changes because they saw the benefits of things like cover crops and compost. Even the conventional farmers, they were looking at their neighbors and seeing this is making a difference. So I think the more that you get, people like Wendy, the people that Wendy's working with and others, people who are leaders and can help other farmers along is really important. So I guess I would ask you all if you would concur. Certainly the climate benefits are great to communicate to those in the broader political arena interested in climate change to get on board. But there's also these many important co-benefits that are so fundamental to our farming future and, the economic viability. So I don't know if any of you have had that experience as well, but like communicating to farmers that these other things are important.
I just want to make a quick comment that the first time I went to present our results to the farming community that we work in, and I started to talk about all the nitrous oxide and CO2 and carbon sequestration, everybody glazed over until I put that net primary productivity, and somebody whispered, I think she means forage. And then everybody went up. And I realized, there's so many co-benefits from building soil organic matter, and that's why we should be doing it anyway. But it's really nice to quantify the greenhouse gas and mitigation and the climate change mitigation, because that's what we need in the long run. So,
yeah, and having visited farmers around the world who are building soil organic matter last year, not a one of them adopted the practices they adopted for climate motivation. None of them. They all adopted them because it made more sense on their farm to reduce their inputs, to conserve water, to save them money while maintaining their productivity, which made a better spread, made them more profitable. To a person, they all said that if they were compensated for the societal benefits of carbon, it would make the case even stronger. But none of them were adopting it for primarily a climate reason. The ones who are the leading adopters, the motivators who are coming and driving this from the bottom up, are doing it for all those co-benefits, just like you suggest.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
This is for Wendy. My name is Jerry Harrison, and my question is: did you do any comparison between adding biochar and compared to compost or combinations in what happened to the soil? And I have a second question is, and I'm not much of an expert on this, but my understanding is that people have been trying to have plants that have less and less roots, so that the energy goes into growing higher and taller and more yield crops. And so how economically do you compensate for that energy going into like deeper roots?
Yeah,
so those are two quite separate questions, but
those are both excellent questions. And we've talked in my lab, we've talked a lot about biochar and something that we're exploring. One of the reasons we chose compost first is it's a lot cheaper and a lot less greenhouse gas intensive to make it, right? And the funny thing is you end up with a relatively similar product at the end, no matter what the inputs are. So the end product, because that's limited by the microbial thermodynamics, is what it comes down to. It's physics. They get down to a point, and that's where we end. And so compost is a little bit more uniform. Biochar is hugely diverse. So one piece of biochar made from one substance is going to behave very differently than another piece of biochar from another substance. And so we've been kind of waiting for colleagues to come up with some of that earlier work to say, well, can we now categorize biochar into categories before we go spend a lot of effort in the field, which is an immense amount of effort to collect this kind of data. We can choose wisely as to, well, what are the biochar types that we might want to utilize? So that we're starting to look at that, and also Sintana Vergara in the back, as my postdoc, is looking also at biochar and composting as a combination. The second question with regard to root biomass is a really critical one, and I think that's where farmers and ranchers really, their understanding of their plants and lands and how to actually manipulate those ecosystems is really important, because any good rancher, any good farmer knows that they've got to build root biomass if they're going to get nutrients and water into their crop. But they also know that they can't build too much root biomass. And the plants have to do that trade-off anyway. They've got to build this stuff to photosynthesize, and they want to reproduce, so they put their energy into this stuff. And we're mostly a lot of what we eat is reproductive parts, right? Sounds weird, but that's what we're eating, the fruits of their labor. And so, you know, the plants are making those trade-offs. That's why I kind of cringe a little bit when it comes to bioengineering, where they're trying to engineer plants to not do what they were made evolutionarily to do, because then you're really messing with the plant's ability to adapt to its environment.
And if I could follow up on that a little bit, the whole idea of trying to reduce the root mass and promote above ground mass is based on out-of-date science. Frankly, it basically ignores the symbioses between life, the microbial life in the soil, and what they actually provide to the plants. The whole reason that the plants are pushing exudates out of their roots in the first place is to promote those ecosystems, because they're of mutual benefit. And the engineering approach of trying to minimize the root is, you know, it falls into the same problems as sort of overuse of nitrogen fertilizers, which then results in less exudates, which is less microbial interaction in the soil. So I think we have to bring to bear the sort of new thinking and new paradigm and thinking about the relationship between plants and soils and microbes, and rethink some of the assumptions behind some of what we consider now conventional practices, and that's a really good example of one.
With that, we do have to, I wanted to just provide a couple of closing thoughts because we are at time. One, David's newest book is co-written with his wife, who unfortunately she's not in here right now, Anne Bickley. And something that I think would be really interesting to think about, one thing we did not talk about, is the relationship between our own microbiome in our bodies and the soil biology and all of the life there. And I think that I would really encourage you to think about that, to read David and his wife's book, because I can see in a couple of years coming back and having that conversation as well as it relates to soil health. And when we talk about all these different amendments and practices, what does it look like when we think about that with our own bodies as well, and we take that to food? So just some food for thought. Second of all, I want to come back to that I find this such an inspiring area, because, you know, when you were talking about how much, you know, at the rate at which we're able to, in partnership with nature, create soil, and how that far exceeds the regular rate that soil would rebuild on its own. It only, you know, puts a period, you know, an exclamation point and whatever else on the point that we are absolutely needed in this conversation. We are absolutely needed as participants in the system, whether it's backyard composting or going to City Hall or working with farmers and ranchers and doing the research. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, thank all of you, and thank you so much for coming to this conference.